It's been more than 9 months since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, killing more than 1,100 people and kidnapping roughly 250. Israel retaliated immediately, and since then, Gaza has been under siege. The Gazan Health Ministry says more than 38,000 people have been killed in the Strip. Meanwhile, Hamas still holds about 120 hostages. So how does this end?
A US plan for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Diplomatic efforts to reach a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas are intensifying.
Hope is rising again for a ceasefire and hostage releases in the war in Gaza.
Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail. Almost since this war started, there have been calls for a ceasefire. So why isn't there one yet? And how does a deal like this get brokered? Marika Sosnowski is a postdoctoral fellow at Melbourne Law School who researches the dynamics of ceasefires. I asked her to take me through a bit of the recent history.
We've had 4 Security Council resolutions now calling for a ceasefire, 2 with specific wording that actually, calls it a ceasefire, and others have called it sort of different names, a humanitarian pause or a cessation of hostilities. But still, those things are a ceasefire. But unfortunately, on the ground, we haven't really seen that they've made a lot of difference. We've had a truce also that was negotiated by Qatar, mainly as the mediator between Israel and Hamas, that came into force for 7 days in November last year. And that was probably the most successful ceasefire that there's been since the attack by Hamas on 7th of October last year. So that actually stopped violence for a period of time and allowed hostages to be released and in exchange for prisoners from Israeli jails.
Here's what the resolution that's currently on the table says.
In phase 1, there will be a approximately 6-week ceasefire. It can be extended. In that period, hostages will be released. In the first phase, that means the sick, the elderly, and women. In return for the release of the hostages, a certain number of Palestinian prisoners will be released from Israeli jails. The Israeli army will withdraw from the Gaza Strip, at least from populated areas of the Gaza Strip. People inside the Gaza Strip will be allowed to return to their homes, and as many as 600 trucks of aid will be allowed into the Gaza Strip every day. That is the bare bones of what's being proposed in the first phase. Once they get past that, if they get past that, they're into stopping the war altogether and the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip.
So the first phase is very sort of similar to this truce that happened in November in that it's quite detailed and very much involves the transfer of hostages in exchange for prisoners. It involves some kind of humanitarian supplies coming into the Strip again. It's scheduled to last about 6 weeks, so 42 days. So the first phase is really the sort of phase when a lot of things, I think, will happen, and it will set the groundwork to see how the sort of second and third phases play out potentially. And I think that's a lot to do with what is kind of the parties are kind of negotiating over at the moment. The second stage currently at the moment in the draft of the text is quite it loses that really specific language and gets a lot more broader in terms of it does still talk about the release of hostages and prisoners. The language is much less specific in how that will actually take place. So I think the thinking is that during that first phase of the ceasefire, the second phase, they will keep on negotiating and keep on talking to each other, the parties, in order to flesh out some of the details of how that second stage will happen. And then the third stage, again, they've slated for 42 days, but I think they've also mentioned a term of 3 to 5 years in terms of sort of a reconstruction plan for the Gaza Strip. But again, this third phase, it's very broad and there's not a lot of detail in terms of who will be sort of providing shelter during that time. They mention specifically homes and civilian facilities and infrastructure, but they don't say, they say that's going to be under the supervision of Qatar and Egypt and the United Nations, but they don't really say who's going to front up the money for that, who's going to implement that in practice, where are people going to go in the Gaza Strip. So there's, again, all this vagueness around the second and third phases of this agreement. And I don't think, look, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, these things can be negotiated, and I think probably the thinking of Qatar and the United States is that a lot of those second and third stages will be negotiated during the 6 weeks of the first stage. And I think what's interesting is that they have set the first stage at 6 weeks. I mean, we saw this truce in November. It was only 7 days. So it really didn't allow a lot of infrastructural or a lot of time for the parties to come to any sort of further agreement on what would happen in the Gaza Strip. Now they've left 42 days. So hopefully during that first phase, they will be able to negotiate some more specifics for the second and third phases. I think it's really important for the international community to start thinking about how those things will occur, because ceasefire is not a panacea. And I think, as we've seen with this conflict between Hamas and Israel, but also between Hamas and the Palestinians more broadly, without some sort of really deep thinking on kind of how to come to some sort of place where Palestinians and Israelis can kind of live together in some sort of humane way, we're just going to, kind of further the dynamics that saw the attack on 7th of October in the first place.
So those are the details of what's in this ceasefire plan. It was proposed by U.S. President Biden in late May. In early June, the United Nations Security Council voted in favor 14-0, with Russia abstaining. So what's the holdup?
My understanding is that the sticking point around this current agreement is basically Hamas wants there to be some sort of guarantee that the ceasefire, as in a halt in military fighting, will go on beyond that first phase of the agreement, and it won't be subject to more negotiation. That's not something that Israel is willing to accede to as yet. So there's been some back and forth on this sort of one particular term of the agreement.
Since then, it's been hard to tell if real progress has been made.
There is new hope for a ceasefire deal here in the Middle East after Hamas responded to a ceasefire proposal this past week, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to send a delegation to restart stalled negotiations. New ceasefire talks are scheduled to take place this week, and the US is urging Israel to negotiate a truce. But Israel doesn't always do what Washington wants.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reiterated that any Gaza ceasefire deal must allow Israel to keep fighting until it achieves its war objectives. Netanyahu insisted that the goals defined at the start of the conflict, including dismantling Hamas's military and governing capabilities and return of all the hostages, must be met.
Part of the agreement says that if the terms of Phase 2 aren't agreed at the end of the first 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue so long as the negotiations do. So why not start the ceasefire immediately while working it out?
Just taking a step back for a moment, I think the easiest way to think about it is probably like a ceasefire deal is like a really complicated contract between these parties, right? So if you've ever negotiated sort of a really tricky business agreement or, even something that someone might have negotiated with their kids or something, you want to make sure that the terms of the agreement are really well spelled out, right? And with this case, this particular case, both sides, obviously you have the people that are going to actually negotiate the deal. But of course, swirling around those people from both Hamas, from Israel, from America and from Qatar, there's a lot of other dynamics that those people are having to take into account. So I'll give you a few examples. So for the Israeli side, just for starters, they obviously, Netanyahu has the domestic politics and the domestic pressure that he's under, first of all, from the families of the people that have been taken hostage to make a deal. But then contrarily, he's got quite a large block of right-wing politicians in his government that, have other concerns and maybe don't want to make a deal under specific terms. And then he's got his own kind of political future as well that he's considering. And, the possible criminal charges that would happen to him if he's not prime minister anymore. So there's all these kind of dynamics swirling around the Israeli side, and that's just, to start with. There's many more than those, and they're just a few that I can mention. On Hamas's side as well, we have, it's not just Hamas that's like an armed actor in Gaza. There's Islamic Jihad. There's other armed actors operating in Gaza that Hamas has to negotiate with and consider as well when it's making a deal. It's also for Hamas, the hostages are a massive kind of they're the only leverage that Hamas has basically got over Israel. The military force of Israel is so great when compared to the ability that Hamas has to attack, to militarily attack Israel now. So the only real card that it has to play are these hostages. So it wants to keep as many cards as it can to ensure that it gets the best thing out of the deal, right? I mean, ceasefires are negotiated usually between parties that clearly don't like each other very much. I mean, in this particular case of Israel and Palestine, there's been like massive dehumanization of parties on both sides. So basically, both sides are trying very hard to get as much as they can out of these deals. So in terms of the continuing nature of the ceasefire, the only real card Hamas has to play are the hostages it still holds. And basically, they want some sort of guarantee that the ceasefire will continue for quite a long time.
And for Israel, promising that is not an attractive prospect. Why is that?
Well, I think both for all those dynamics, internal dynamics and that I mentioned earlier, but also because it's hard to say, but I mean, it started this war saying that it wanted to eliminate Hamas entirely. It obviously, if it has a permanent ceasefire with Hamas, it's clear that it hasn't done that. So I don't know how much that is playing into their calculations. And again, all those domestic dynamics of the political situation in terms of the right wing possibly not wanting to make a deal with Hamas that leads to a permanent ceasefire. I don't know how much incentive they have in terms of territorial occupation of the Gaza Strip. There's already been talk, even with a ceasefire, that there'll be the buffer between Israel and Gaza that buffer zone will be extended to 1 kilometre, and that there'll be sort of military corridors in the middle of Gaza and at the south along the Egyptian border that'll be quite wide as well. And so there is talk already that the territory that Israel will basically occupy in Gaza after any sort of ceasefire will be around 30% of the current land of Gaza, which isn't actually very big to begin with. The Gaza Strip's only about sort of 10 kilometres across at its widest point, and then about 40 kilometres long. So you take away 30% of that land and you don't have very much land left for, 1 million, 2 million people, basically.
Okay. I want to know more about how a ceasefire is actually brokered. So can you walk me through the steps that it takes to get there, kind of starting at the Security Council and ending up, I suppose, I don't know, is there a room that people are in? Are we talking about phone calls? How does it work?
Yeah. So again, I think an interesting analogy is of this kind of contract. So you can imagine two parties that don't like each other a lot or don't like each other at all. Often, like in the case of Hamas and Israel, those people won't be meeting face to face. So usually with these kind of deals, a lot of the time what happens is they'll literally meet in a hotel. In what I'm imagining happens in this kind of deal is Hamas officials will be staying at a hotel in Doha in Qatar, and then Israeli officials will fly in and stay potentially on another floor in the hotel, and then the Qatari officials will be in some other room of that hotel, and basically each party will kind of shuttle back and forth between the Qataris, who will then kind of relay each other's messages and each other's demands to the different parties, basically. So that's often how it works. Often it's as mundane as a hotel or something like that. And obviously, phone calls and stuff like that. I mean, the US officials will probably be there for these specific negotiations that are kind of taking place, I think, quite soon. But, there's a lot of phone calls and we've seen US officials, flying to Israel very, very often. There would have been a lot of phone calls, happening between US officials and Israeli officials and the Qatari negotiators. Qatari negotiators would have been speaking to Hamas quite a lot, all this kind of pressure and communication.
Well, and you say the U.S. officials will probably be there for these negotiations that will be happening quite soon. What do you mean by that? Like, why do we think they're happening quite soon?
My sense is that Hamas is willing to negotiate on this kind of the continuance of the ceasefire clause, like the halt in fighting or the permanent nature of the ceasefire. My understanding is that the US senses that there might be some sort of momentum or there is some movement in terms of Hamas and potentially then Israel willing to negotiate on these terms, so willing to come out of the positions that they've set for themselves and potentially agree to something else. So I think they feel like there's a little bit of momentum there. So they would be keen to kind of capitalize on that and try to sort of bring the parties to some sort of agreement on those terms, basically, which is, I think, why they will probably want to be there if there is some sort of in-person negotiation to the extent, that's possible between the parties.
What happens when this deal is signed? Is it a magic switch where the troops are out, the bombs stop, humanitarian aid is in, the hostages are released, or what does that look like?
I think that's a good question because, basically that's why they invest a lot of time into negotiating these terms, because it's like a contract is they will go literally off the terms that they have negotiated in the contract. So if a term says this ceasefire is going to come into effect on day X, they will, the idea then is that the parties who have signed a ceasefire then will implement the ceasefire according to the terms of the contract that they have agreed to, basically. So whatever that contract says, and ideally that's why I think for me, and that's what my research suggests, is that the more detailed the terms, the better chance there is logically of the parties implementing the ceasefire, because they know exactly what they're meant to do at particular times and kind of how they're meant to do it. And that's exactly what we saw back with the truce in November, right? The terms were super specific and basically highly choreographed, but basically both parties, both Hamas and Israel, but also the Red Cross that helped facilitate the release of the hostages and the prisoners, Egypt, where prisoners and hostages were sort of released in exchange along their border. Everyone knew exactly what the dance was. So that's why basically the terms of the agreement are so important.
There are lots of laws around war. Are there any laws about ceasefires in terms of when it's time to have one and what it needs to look like?
Really interestingly, there are actually no laws specifically, there's no international law specifically related to ceasefires. I think that's really interesting sort of practical choice around international law. And I think it sort of speaks to the fact that ceasefires exist in this space between war, law, and politics. And international law doesn't necessarily think that it should prescribe how a ceasefire is going to come about.
So once the document is signed and the ceasefire is agreed upon, is it binding and is it enforceable? And can one side just decide to not follow part of it?
The short answer is no, it's not binding. It's binding in so much as a contract would be binding. Again, there's no international law around saying that a ceasefire agreement between the parties then is legally binding on the parties. The most binding legally that we've had so far is these Security Council resolutions, which according to international law are legally binding on the parties. But as we've seen, that hasn't really made much difference in practice. So the best way to get parties to adhere to a ceasefire agreement is that if they kind of invest time and effort into negotiating these terms of the agreement, and then they're much more likely, basically, to abide by the terms of the agreement. But effectively, there's nothing to, besides international pressure, or, if the international community decides to enforce it in some way, there's nothing legally binding about a ceasefire agreement per se.
That UN Security Council resolution, even though that is legally binding, there's just no mechanism to enforce it, so it just doesn't really matter? Is that what you're saying?
That's the case with most international law, basically. Is that most states abide by international law most of the time, right? But sometimes they don't, and in the case of these Security Council resolutions, they haven't. And yeah, there are tools, right? We have things like sanctions, we have things like diplomatic pressure, we have things like the International Court of, international justice mechanisms. States can use military force to force other states to adhere to the terms of a Security Council resolution. Some of those are happening in the case of this ceasefire. We see the ramping up of international pressure on Israel to stop fighting, to abide by international law. So we do see international pressure. We see more states recognising Palestine. All this is part of the dynamics of the ceasefire.
But Marika says we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking a ceasefire is the be-all, end-all in this war.
There's been a general narrative that, a ceasefire will be a panacea, and that, a ceasefire will be inherently a good thing for a conflict. And I guess, look, of course, if we can stop the parties fighting for a period of time, that can really be a good thing. And I think in the case of Israel and Hamas, it would be a good thing if the parties stop fighting for a period of time. But what a lot of my research says is that we shouldn't be blinded by this kind of positive humanitarian nature that sort of the idea of a ceasefire creates, and we should think more broadly about some of the additional dynamics that a ceasefire can affect. For example, the territorial control of Gaza, and I mentioned that to you already. Will Israel retain control over 30% of the territory of Gaza under any ceasefire deal? That's quite a serious thing, that maybe a ceasefire deal could facilitate if it be the case. Another example might be there have been obviously a lot of Gazans that have left the Gaza Strip during the current conflict. How will they be able to get back into Gaza? How will that be facilitated? How will that happen? Or will they be permanently displaced outside of Gaza? And this ceasefire won't speak to how they can return, because obviously to return to Gaza takes, Egypt needs to agree to them to return. And I think because of Israeli control over the Rafah crossing now, Israel will have to agree for them to return as well. So how do the terms of a ceasefire entrench kind of other sort of dynamics that might disproportionately affect one side or the other that, we might not necessarily think about immediately when we think ceasefire, basically.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production funded by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thanks to Marika Sosnowski. I'm Gwen McClure. Ka kite.